The sun hung low on the horizon of the barren planet they'd just landed on, casting long, eerie shadows across the alien landscape. Grays, browns, and rusted reds were the only colors that seemed to cling to the ground. Above them, the sky was a dark orange streaked with purple clouds, an odd mix of things that didn't belong in the same place. The shuttle doors hissed open, the metallic sound almost exaggerated in the stillness of the place. "We made it," Vero said, sounding almost proud of himself as he stepped onto the dusty soil, his boots kicking up a cloud of reddish dirt. "Yeah," Kaya replied, her voice a little more skeptical as she surveyed the vast emptiness of the planet. "But I still don't get why we're here. This place doesn't even look survivable." "Oh, it's survivable," Vero grinned back, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "At least, that's what the mission briefing said. The galaxy's most dangerous slavers operate here, and that's where we come in. Time to put the human in. Humans aren't gonna take your crap anymore." Kaya stared at him for a moment, blinking in confusion. "Wait, you mean we're supposed to take out slavers here? You didn't mention this was the mission when you roped me into coming." He shrugged, an exaggerated motion that did little to hide the tension in his posture. "Did I mention it's our mission? We're the ones assigned to disrupt the slaver networks. This planet is the key to ending them." And, he paused, his grin widening. "I may have promised the higher-ups we could be more effective with a team of 2 humans. You know, for the shock factor." Kaya tilted her head, eyeing him with suspicion. "You're telling me this isn't just a revenge gig for what happened last year with those pirates?" Vero hesitated, eyes darting away for a moment. "Not just revenge. But, yeah. A bit of that, too." She could hardly believe her ears. "You're dragging me to a desert world on some wild slavers beware mission that sounds like you made up just so you could get your hands on some payback?" "Exactly," Vero said with a chuckle, totally unfazed. "I mean, think about it. We're human. That means we get things done. We're resourceful. We're tough. And we're definitely not afraid of a few alien slavers. Especially when those slavers think they're untouchable." "You're seriously out of your mind," Kaya muttered, kicking at the ground. "But since we're here, what's the plan?" His grin didn't fade. "Oh, we have a plan. But let's go over it as we move." It was that kind of reckless confidence that Kaya couldn't quite seem to get used to. Vero wasn't just fearless, he was almost unnervingly optimistic. That was his charm, in a way. But Kaya knew the truth behind it. He had a reputation of getting himself, and others, into more trouble than anyone cared to handle. Still, when it came to the job, they were the team. And that meant she would follow his lead, even if it felt like they were walking into a trap. She adjusted the grip on her rifle and followed him as he set off toward the jagged ridge that led into the planet's fractured desert terrain. Her boots crunched against the dry ground, and she squinted against the dust and harsh sun. Behind them, the shuttle was already a distant speck on the horizon. The only sound now was the howling wind. They didn't talk much as they trekked toward the ridge. Their mission was still a hazy blur, full of unknowns and what-ifs. The briefing they'd received had been sparse on details, a list of coordinates and the promise of a prize, a cache of ancient weapons held by the slavers, weapons that were said to have been used in a number of conquests across the galaxy. By the time they reached the base of the ridge, the sun was sinking lower, casting a cold, hollow shadow over the land. Vero glanced over at Kaya and gave her a quick nod. She didn't know if it was for reassurance or to say "I told you so," but she was already sick of the dry air, sick of the dust, and sick of being here. "So, we're just walking into their base, right? No more secret infiltration or reconnaissance?" Kaya asked, her voice a little sharp now. Vero grinned again, that maddening grin. "Nope. No time for that. We hit them fast, hard, and with everything we've got. We make our presence known, and they won't know what hit them." Kaya stared at him for a moment, still trying to figure out how much of this was the plan and how much was him making it up as they went along. "I really hope you know what you're doing." "Of course I do," Vero replied, never breaking stride. "Remember, the whole human spirit thing? We're relentless. They'll never see us coming. She sighed. As usual, the plan seemed like it was mostly about charging into danger with guns blazing, hoping that luck or sheer willpower would carry them through. As they climbed up the jagged path, a strange sound rippled through the air, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. Kaya paused, her hand instinctively going to the sidearm at her hip. "You hear that?" she asked, glancing at Vero. He stopped and listened intently, his eyes narrowing as the sound intensified. It was a rhythmic, droning noise, not unlike the hum of a massive machine or a ship's engines. "Could be them," Vero muttered under his breath. "Or it could be something worse." They continued cautiously, keeping to the shadows of the rocks as much as possible. The air felt heavy, and the wind seemed to carry strange, almost haunting echoes. When they reached the top of the ridge, the sight that greeted them was nothing like they'd expected. Below, nestled in the valley between two massive, jagged cliffs, was an enormous fortress-like structure, dark, imposing, and riddled with what appeared to be a series of energy shields surrounding its perimeter. Outside the walls, there were half a dozen large vehicles parked in a haphazard formation, each one brimming with heavily armed guards. And they weren't alone. The unmistakable silhouettes of more slavers, their forms towering and grotesque, moved like shadows between the vehicles, engaged in their usual grim business. They were hauling prisoners, humans, by the looks of it, from cages into the base, their eyes hollow with despair. "Okay," Vero said, voice low and controlled. "Looks like we found the slavers. Now the fun begins." Kaya clenched her jaw, her gaze fixed on the prisoners. Her mind raced, calculating the distance, the firepower they had, and the best way to bring down the whole operation. "Do you think we can take them all down without backup?" Vero's smile returned, and for a moment, Kaya could have sworn she saw a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. "We don't need backup. We just need to make them believe we're a whole lot bigger than we are." Kaya had a sinking feeling in her gut. This wasn't going to be as simple as walking in and blowing everything up. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Yet, the truth of it was undeniable, the slavers were only part of the problem. The bigger issue was how they, two humans, were supposed to make a dent in a system that had been in place for centuries. But there was one thing she knew: humans had a way of surprising everyone when they were pushed to the limit. "Let's do this," she said with finality, her voice steady even though her heart was racing. They were about to make their mark, and whether they liked it or not, the slavers would soon find out just how dangerous a cornered human could be. As the wind whipped around them, Kaya crouched low behind a boulder, her fingers wrapped tightly around the rifle's grip, her eyes scanning the perimeter of the slaver's stronghold. Vero stood beside her, his posture relaxed, almost casual, as if he had all the time in the galaxy. His eyes glinted in the dim light of the setting sun, focused but full of that almost reckless confidence she had come to both respect and dread. "This is it," Vero muttered, not taking his eyes off the fortress. "Now we just need to figure out how to get in." Kaya looked over at him. "You're still thinking we walk in the front door, aren't you?" He flashed her a grin. "Why not? It's not like we've got any subtlety left. Plus, it's more fun this way. Trust me, they'll never expect it." Her instinct screamed to disagree, to take the safer, smarter route, anything but charging in head first. But the truth was, she knew he was right. The slavers had been operating for years with little fear of retaliation, their empire built on the backs of countless prisoners. They had probably grown too comfortable, too arrogant. Kaya pushed those doubts aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. "Fine. Let's assume we're going through the front. How do you plan on taking down the shields? There's no way we're getting close with that kind of firepower standing between us." Vero's grin didn't fade. "I've got a little something up my sleeve. Just follow my lead." For all his bravado, she couldn't deny the flicker of admiration that rose in her chest at how well he had planned things so far. He had a knack for improvisation that was unnerving but strangely effective. Kaya exhaled sharply, standing up and pulling her scarf over her face to protect from the dust. The time for hesitation had passed. "I'm with you. Just don't make me regret this. Vero nodded, his eyes scanning the outer perimeter of the slaver base. They could hear the low hum of the energy shields now, as if they were a living, breathing thing. The force field stretched from one end of the base to the other, shimmering faintly in the dying light. It was an obstacle, but not one that Vero seemed concerned about. We'll need to create a distraction. One big enough to draw their attention but not so big that we end up getting caught in it, Vero explained. His voice had shifted, becoming more businesslike as he looked over their options. Kaya frowned. You're still planning on hitting them straight on? He shrugged. What else can we do? There are guards everywhere. You can't sneak past that. We hit them hard enough and fast enough, they won't have time to react. They had no choice but to move. The plan, such as it was, had to be executed now before they lost the element of surprise. They had no backup, no reinforcements coming to help. The galaxy wasn't kind enough to send aid when needed, and Vero was right, they were humans, and it was time to show the slavers exactly why that mattered. Vero gestured for Kaya to follow him as he began moving toward the base's outer wall, crouching low as they neared a series of communication towers. They ducked between the towers and scrambled to a small, rocky outcrop just outside the range of the main guard posts. Kaya's heart hammered in her chest as she watched Vero set to work, fiddling with a small, metallic device. This should do it, he muttered, his fingers working quickly, his concentration intense. He attached a small explosive to a nearby conduit running to one of the shield generators. This will knock out the shields for a few minutes, long enough for us to get in and cause some chaos. Kaya's brow furrowed. What if the damage is more than we expect? You're sure this thing won't fry the whole base? Vero paused, looking up at her with that same unshakable grin. Well, I'm pretty sure. But if I'm wrong, then I guess we better run really fast. She rolled her eyes but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. That was Vero's charm. He was reckless and impulsive, but somehow, he managed to make things work. Kaya could never understand how, but she had learned to trust that crazy plan of his, if only because the alternative was usually worse. With a final click, Vero stepped back. The explosive device was set. He tapped it once to make sure it was armed, and they both sprinted back to the cover of a nearby rock, waiting. The seconds felt like hours. A distant shout broke the stillness of the air, a slaver guard somewhere within the walls yelling orders. Kaya's breath caught in her throat, but before she could react, the ground under her feet rumbled. A bright flash of energy lit up the atmosphere, and then silence. The shields flickered, their faint hum suddenly gone. The sky seemed to hold its breath as the blinding light of the explosion faded, leaving only a deep, echoing quiet. It was the moment they'd been waiting for. Now, Vero whispered, and without another word, they both bolted toward the gap in the shield. The force field had been neutralized, the path ahead wide open. They moved quickly, slipping through the opening just as the sound of alarms rang out from within the fortress. The slavers had finally realized what was happening. Too late. They were in. Inside the perimeter, it was chaos. Armed slavers scattered in every direction, shouting at each other as they tried to figure out how to deal with the breach. Vero had predicted it perfectly. The explosive had done its job, short-circuiting the power grid just long enough to throw the defenders into a panic. Take out the guards first, Kaya hissed, her rifle raised as they rounded a corner and spotted a small squad of slavers rushing toward them, blasters drawn. We can't let them regroup. On it, Vero replied, already moving ahead, his speed and agility a blur as he dodged blaster fire. He fired his pistol with pinpoint precision, taking down the first two slavers with a swift shot to the head. Kaya followed close behind, lining up a shot and dropping another two before they had a chance to respond. The rest of the slavers hesitated for only a moment before they began firing back. Time to make a statement, Vero muttered, and then he dropped to the ground, rolling under a blast of plasma fire. Kaya turned and moved with him, using the confusion to her advantage as she leapt over debris, her rifle kicking up sparks with each shot. But this wasn't just a fight. It was a message. The slavers may have thought themselves untouchable, but they were about to learn the price of underestimating humanity. As the last of the guards fell, Kaya wiped sweat from her brow and turned to Vero, who was grinning like a madman. "Now, we make them remember who they're dealing with," he said, his voice full of a fire that Kaya had seen only in the eyes of those who had nothing left to lose. The fight was just beginning, and they had no intention of letting up. But as the sound of more footsteps echoed from deeper inside the fortress, they realized this was only the first wave. There was still much more to do. The slavers would soon find out that they had seriously underestimated the power of a human, especially two humans on a mission. And as they advanced deeper into the base, Kaya felt a surge of something rare and dangerous: hope. They could win this. They would win this. The war for survival had just begun. The fortress was chaos now, a storm of fire and confusion. Slaver soldiers scrambled through the hallways, trying to organize a defense, but their efforts were haphazard at best. Vero's strategy had worked too well, in fact. They'd breached the first line of defense with little resistance, but now the entire base was in full alert. The slavers were starting to regroup, and Kaya could hear the sound of more reinforcements arriving, their heavy footsteps reverberating off the metal walls of the fortress. "You hearing this?" Kaya panted as she crouched behind an abandoned supply crate, taking a moment to reload. The blaster fire had become a constant hum in the background, punctuated by the occasional explosion. "Yeah," Vero said with a grin that was dangerously close to manic. He wasn't even out of breath. "They're not too happy we're here, are they?" Kaya could hear the faintest echo of dread creeping into her voice as she surveyed their surroundings. "Vero, we're pushing our luck. We've already got a squad coming up from the east wing and another from the west. We can't keep this pace up." He shot her a sidelong glance, his eyes still brimming with that reckless energy. "Don't worry about it. We'll just keep them running in circles. I've got something else up my sleeve. We're not done yet." She shook her head but followed him as he dashed to another corner of the hallway, his figure disappearing into the shadows. Her heart was pounding, the adrenaline from the initial assault starting to fade, replaced by the harsh reality of the situation. They had infiltrated deep into the heart of slaver territory, but now they were deep enough that getting out again was no longer an option. The stakes were higher than ever, and they were beginning to run out of time. They turned a corner into a massive central chamber. It was a cavernous room with high ceilings, reinforced walls, and rows upon rows of weapon crates and equipment lockers. But what caught Kaya's attention was the row of large, sleek transports lined up along one side. These weren't just any vehicles, they were heavily armored and fast. The slavers had been planning an evacuation. That meant something big was coming. "Vero," she hissed, catching his arm before he could rush forward. "Look. Those transports, they're loading up. We don't have much time." Vero stopped, his usual cocky smile faltering for a brief second as he studied the transports. His brow furrowed. "They're getting ready to flee. They think they've lost, but they're gonna pull out. We can't let them go, Kaya. Not like this." "But how?" She gestured toward the growing number of slaver soldiers closing in from both sides. "There's no way we can hold them off long enough to destroy those transports. We're outmanned and outgunned." Vero gave her a sidelong glance, a dark gleam in his eyes. "We don't need to hold them off. We just need to make sure they don't get out of here." She felt a sickening twist of unease in her stomach. "You've got another one of your crazy plans, don't you?" His grin returned, wicked and unfazed. "What's the point of being human if you can't think outside the box?" Kaya was about to ask what he meant when a loud explosion rattled the walls of the chamber, sending a shower of sparks from a nearby power conduit. Her eyes widened as a fresh wave of slavers poured into the room, their weapons raised and firing immediately. "Guess it's showtime," Vero said, ducking behind cover and firing a shot at the nearest group of slavers. His aim was precise, his movements fluid, but Kaya could see the look in his eyes. He was working against the clock. "Cover me!" Vero yelled, charging toward the nearest transport. Kaya didn't hesitate. She followed him, taking down a few slavers who attempted to block their path. Her pulse was a drumbeat in her ears as she sprinted behind Vero, her mind racing. The transports were close now, and with every step, the danger of being overrun grew. There were too many enemies, too many weapons pointed in their direction, and the room was quickly becoming a death trap. But she trusted Vero. She didn't have a choice. They reached the transport, and Kaya barely had time to process what was happening before Vero dove into the cockpit of one of the vehicles, slamming the hatch closed behind him. Kaya's heart skipped a beat as the engines of the transport roared to life. For a moment, she was just standing there, staring at the massive vehicle, not sure what had just happened. Then, Vero's voice crackled through the comlink in her earpiece. "I hope you're ready to go for a ride." Kaya's stomach flipped, and for a split second, she considered running. She wasn't ready for whatever mad idea Vero had just come up with. But there was no turning back now. She gritted her teeth and sprinted toward the transport, diving into the open hatch just as a barrage of plasma fire slammed into the ground where she had been standing a moment before. Inside, the interior was cold, mechanical, and eerily quiet. Vero was already working furiously at the controls, his face a mask of concentration. He didn't look up when she climbed into the co-pilot seat. "You ever flown one of these things?" he asked, his voice tight. Kaya's jaw clenched. "Not exactly." Vero gave her a look but didn't waste time explaining. "Well, better learn quick, because we've got company." He slapped a button on the control panel, and the transport's massive thrusters ignited with a loud roar, sending the vehicle surging forward. The vehicle's speed was disorienting, and Kaya struggled to keep her balance as Vero expertly maneuvered them through the chaos, dodging blasts and debris. The slavers on the ground didn't know what hit them as Vero expertly cut through their lines, driving the transport like it was a toy in his hands. Kaya held on for dear life, her eyes darting between the controls and the enemies closing in. They were leaving a trail of destruction in their wake, slavers scrambling to get out of their way as the armored transport tore through their defenses. And yet, despite the mayhem, something clicked in Kaya's mind. This was insane. It was reckless. But it was also working. Vero didn't pause for a second, steering the transport toward the base's eastern wall, where a massive blast door was slowly closing. "We're taking this thing through the wall," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "Hang on." Kaya barely had time to process his words before the transport hit the blast door at full speed, its front end slamming into the reinforced barrier with an ear-splitting crash. Sparks flew, the impact rattling her teeth, but the vehicle didn't stop. The door buckled, then cracked, and with one final, thunderous explosion, the wall gave way, sending them hurtling into the open desert beyond. The transport skidded to a stop on the cracked, red earth, and Kaya's breath caught in her throat as the dust settled. They had done it. They were out. Vero let out a whoop of exhilaration, his grin wider than ever. "Now, that's how you make an exit." Kaya sat frozen for a moment, processing what had just happened. She could hear the distant wail of alarms from behind them, but for now, they were safe. For now, they had won. But the war wasn't over. "We still need to take down their leadership," Kaya said, her voice steady despite the chaos of the last few minutes. Vero glanced over at her, his grin still in place. "You think I forgot about that? We're just getting started. Finish what they started." The slavers had made a grave mistake by underestimating them. The fight wasn't over yet. And as they revved the engines and began their next assault, Kaya could feel the weight of it all settle in her chest. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the freedom of everyone the slavers had ever oppressed. And they were going to win. But first, they would finish what they started. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light across the jagged desert landscape. Kaya sat in the cockpit of the transport, her fingers drumming nervously on the console as Vero adjusted the controls. The adrenaline from their escape still surged in her veins, but as the minutes ticked by, the reality of the situation settled over her. The slavers had been shaken, their infrastructure cracked, but the war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And though they had dealt a significant blow, the real battle was just beginning. Vero's voice crackled over the intercom, snapping her from her thoughts. "We're almost there. I can feel the tension. You ready for this?" Kaya exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the horizon. The fortress, a towering monstrosity behind them, was now just a speck in the distance. Their mission was almost complete, but the final hurdle was still looming, getting to the slavers' leadership. "We've already got one hell of a dent in their operation," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with weariness. "But I know you, Vero. You didn't drag me across the galaxy just for a little disruption. What's next?" Vero didn't look at her, but the glint in his eyes said everything she needed to know. He was as stubborn as ever, and this wasn't about making a statement. It was about breaking the slavers' power for good. They were going for the heart of it all, the core of the network that had enslaved millions, and if they didn't finish it now, the threat would loom over countless worlds. The two of them had already taken down the outer perimeter, the soldiers, the transport vehicles. They'd even obliterated a good chunk of the base's defenses. But the heart of the slaver operation was inside the high-security command center, a heavily fortified stronghold hidden deep within the planet's vast underground network. It was there the real danger lay, and it was there they had to strike. "We make our move now," Vero continued, his voice laced with the energy of someone who knew the endgame was close. "We're going to take out their leadership, wipe out the core, and destroy every asset we can find. We're going to make them pay for what they've done. This place ends with us." Kaya nodded, her fingers tightening around the weapon at her side. "You're right. If we don't take them down now, they'll only rebuild. This is our last shot." The transport rumbled as it picked up speed, tearing through the desert terrain with a deep hum. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. Ahead, the entrance to the underground base was visible, a massive, reinforced structure hidden beneath layers of rock, the very heart of the slaver operation. A sleek, black gateway, shielded by dozens of guards, automated defenses, and fortified entrances, loomed before them. Vero was already calculating the best route, his eyes darting over the maps in front of him. "We've got no time to waste," he muttered. "This is where they keep the leaders, the masterminds behind everything. We hit hard, we hit fast, and we don't stop until it's over." Kaya felt the tension in the air as they approached the compound. It was now or never. The transport slowed as they neared the entrance, and the first of the defenses began to activate. Automated turrets locked onto them, their targeting systems flashing red as they powered up. But this wasn't the first time Kaya had seen a heavily armed enemy. She adjusted her seat, pulling her rifle closer, ready for whatever came next. Vero didn't flinch. "Full throttle," he ordered. "They think we're just another bunch of rebels. Let's prove them wrong." With that, he slammed his foot down on the pedal, sending the transport roaring forward at breakneck speed. Kaya's heart leapt into her throat as they barreled toward the entrance, the automated guns firing in rapid succession. The air around them exploded in a flurry of sparks as the weapons locked onto their transport. But Vero was faster. He expertly steered the vehicle through the barrage, zigzagging at impossible speeds, the engine screaming as it tore through the air. Kaya fired back with precision, her shots hitting the turrets with deadly accuracy, taking them out one by one. The automated defenses started to fail, the turrets sparking and collapsing in on themselves. Then they hit the wall. With a massive jolt, the transport slammed into the reinforced gates of the base, smashing through the barrier like it was made of paper. Kaya was thrown forward, the impact sending her sprawling, but she quickly regained her bearings, grabbing her weapon. "We're in," Vero said with a wild grin, barely holding the steering wheel as he guided them deeper into the base. "Just keep up, and keep shooting." They didn't have much time. The slavers were already scrambling to counterattack. Soldiers poured out of hidden alcoves, weapons drawn. Kaya barely had time to react before she began picking them off one by one, her rifle spitting fire as she covered their advance. She could hear the frantic shouts of the slavers as they attempted to regroup, but it was already too late. Their world was collapsing. Vero didn't let up. He pushed the transport deeper into the heart of the base, straight into the command center, where the heart of the slaver empire pulsed. There was no turning back now. It was a war zone, and Kaya could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. The slavers' leadership had been waiting for this. They knew the humans had come for them, and they were ready. But the surprise wasn't on the slavers anymore, it was on Vero and Kaya. Inside the command center, the walls were lined with holographic screens, buzzing with activity. The high-ranking slavers, seated in their cushioned chairs, looked up in shock as the transport plowed through the door. The flicker of realization spread across their faces, but it was too late to do anything about it. Kaya's eyes locked onto the leader, the one responsible for the galaxy's suffering, the one who had orchestrated the destruction of countless civilizations. He was older, his skin pale, his eyes cold and calculating. But there was fear now, fear that they were no longer untouchable. Vero didn't hesitate. He jumped from the transport, drawing his blaster as he charged toward the leader's desk. "It's over," he snarled, voice filled with the kind of fury that only came after a lifetime of pain. "Your empire dies today." Kaya followed, her gun raised, scanning the room. The slavers tried to draw their weapons, but they were too slow. She fired first, taking down two before they could even react. The room erupted into chaos. The slaver leaders shouted orders, but their commands were drowned out by the hail of gunfire. Vero, relentless, moved like lightning, dropping slaver after slaver with well-placed shots. Kaya covered him, her rifle steady in her hands, sweeping the room, eliminating any threat that came too close. Finally, with a swift movement, Vero reached the leader's desk. The man tried to raise his hands in surrender, but Vero wasn't having it. He fired. The slaver leader crumpled, his life extinguished in an instant. And with that, it was over. The command center fell silent. Kaya stood there, panting, sweat slick on her brow. It was done. The heart of the slaver empire had been cut out. The leadership was dead. The network would collapse, and the galaxy would be free of their tyranny. Vero leaned against the desk, his expression still one of exhilaration but tinged with something deeper, satisfaction, perhaps, or a weary understanding of the cost of their actions. "We did it," Kaya said quietly, though her voice was thick with a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. "We actually did it." Vero gave her a small smile, but it was a tired one. "Yeah. We did." They stood in the wreckage of the command center, surrounded by the ruins of the slaver empire. And in that moment, Kaya knew they had changed everything. The galaxy would never be the same. The victory was theirs.